a need that was being surfaced by the community of researchers, and we also knew that this was a foundational issue that needed to be dealt with. And because these challenges were coming from the community of researchers, it really set the tone for using it as the first set of dialogues that CoreNet would have. As Babita has said, the idea of CoreNet is not just to collaborate and collectivize to work on syntheses and research outputs for policy influence, but also on the back end is to improve the rigor and the impact and the value of the research that we are doing. And so for us, really understanding what are some of the guiding principles of ethical research in mobile surveys, what are the principles that each of us have used, what are the challenges that we've faced, and how have we dealt with those challenges became really important. And as we started to do that, we realized there isn't one set of guiding principles that was available. So for us, this also became an imperative that this conversation, this set of dialogues that we are creating could actually help us create something that we could say as a community of practice, these are some of the principles and guidelines we believe are important. The way we've curated this conversation today is to have two sessions, one on vulnerability and one on gender. And obviously they are not mutually exclusive. The first set of panelists are going to talk about some of the issues around exclusion and vulnerable populations and how the changing notions of vulnerability that came up between April and June. And I don't need to say that the reason that happened is just the unprecedented migration that happened in the country that just led us to a heightened awareness and sensitivity of what was happening, layers of vulnerability that I think had not been anticipated, and that possibly had not been anticipated when people were even writing their research protocols. The second session is on gender, which is a specific, I would say, sub-condition or case of broader vulnerabilities. And of course, there's a lot of intersectionality. The second session is going to focus on surveys that have tried to understand differential impacts on women, where the respondents themselves were women, and what has happened, what have been the challenges, and again, some of the specific ethical challenges of dealing with that subpopulation, and again, what were some of the ways in which researchers have tried to address it, and what are some of the ways in which challenges remain outstanding. So the next slide, please. Okay, so just, I think many of you are familiar with the historical tenets of ethics and where all of this comes from. But I think the reason we are framing it in this conversation with using the Bellman principles of justice, beneficence, respect, and confidentiality is because a lot of the challenges that are coming up are very specific kinds of challenges within each of these buckets. So really, how do we contextualize research ethics, both evoking historical tenets and principles, but also contemporizing them to current issues with mobile surveys? And that's really what this conversation is about. So under justice, are we really sure we are reaching the vulnerable populations that our research is meant to target? Are we excluding certain groups because they don't have the mobiles, because we can't build a sampling frame to identify those groups? And are we exclusively including vulnerable populations and creating more distress for that subgroup? And then the notion of who is vulnerable itself is changing, as I had mentioned earlier. Under the whole idea of doing no harm or beneficence, we wanted to really understand, how do we know that the conversations, these mobile surveys and the questions we are asking, how do we know that they're not raising more anxiety, more stress, and more distress for the respondent? Because we already know that much of our conversation is happening in a heightened state of stress and distress for respondents to begin with. And these might be individuals who are in particular kind of disadvantaged situations vis-a-vis COVID. And in doing so, in our ethical protocols in our approach to design the studies? How did we minimize the harm that could be caused by doing these studies? And if there were specific calls for referrals, for redressals, were we able to help? Are there existing services out there? And what is the landscape of existing counseling services for referrals? And even when we refer our respondents, do we know that do they get any recourse for that? So the whole set of issues, which I think become very unique in the case of mobile surveys because we are not there in that context in front of the respondent. Very interesting conversations around how consent was sought. Sorry, I'll take a couple more minutes here. I think early conversations amongst the research partners, I think there were 17 organizations that started interacting and collaborating before CoNet was actually formed. And it was like really, what were the scripts for seeking consent that each of these organizations used? Can we share these scripts? What was revealed? What was disclosed? What did we say to the respondent in terms of being able to stop conversations, leave the survey? Did actually any of those incidents happen? Were the incentives that were used, and were those incentives appropriate to the situation, and could they be considered as creating bias in some way, or bringing in populations that are not truly vulnerable, or making people motivated to respond differently than had there not been incentives? And lastly, confidentiality. That's really interesting because I was just reading about online ethics of online surveys this morning. And one of the advantages of online is actually that it does confer certain privacy to the respondent. But in this case, we actually don't know whether we are helping, we are protecting privacy and confidentiality for the respondent, because we don't know what is happening in the context where they're situated, when they're answering these surveys. There were some interesting conversations from last time's chat where somebody asked, I think Rashmi asked this question: how do you know that the woman hasn't put her phone on speaker, and how do you not know somebody's listening to her and made her do that? We even know with paper surveys that there's a lot of intrusion of family members. So how do we really understand privacy and confidentiality, and how do we really protect it in the case of mobile surveys? So again, and what are the innovations and different approaches people have taken in understanding, or at least interrogating, each of these principles for the work that they were designing? Next slide. Okay, so these are our panelists for today's conversation. The first the first panel is going to be curated and moderated by my colleague Sunita Krishnan. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Sunita, and I'll come back for the gender session.
Okay, great. Thanks, Priya, for the setup, and good evening to everyone. So as Priya mentioned, we're going to start off our discussion on ethics in research on the impacts of COVID-19 with a focus on the broad issues related to vulnerability and gathering information on vulnerable populations, on factors that drive vulnerability, particularly through remote data collection methods. So let me introduce the panel, and before we move on, reminder that if you have questions, comments as the panelists speak, please actively use the chat box. And if you have a specific solution that you've developed and implemented, or you've hypothesized, please also note that in the chat box. We will be gathering all of the inputs that you're providing and doing a quick report back at the end of the session today, as well as including it in our summary. If you're suggesting a solution, please use the prefix S so that we know that's what you're your contribution is towards. Okay, so moving along, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Tarun. Tarun is from Indus Action. And so Tarun, your questions are sort of have to do with how did you know you were targeting the right population, and what kinds of challenges did you anticipate? Over to you, Tarun.
Thanks, Sunita, for giving me the opportunity. Good evening, everyone. So at Indus Action, our focus of our work is to enable access to legislated rights for vulnerable citizens. And prior to COVID, our work was focused on right to education and right to food campaigns. And that was a starting point. In the last 7 years, we've done kind of campaigns across 19 states. And so we had a database to start kind of working with. And we knew from our work that this was either economically or socially disadvantaged families who either kind of through kind of both the policies were already screened for disadvantage, either pregnant mothers who are eligible for maternity entitlements under the National Food Security Act, or economically or socially disadvantaged children who are eligible for the affirmative action clause with the right to education. So for us, the starting point was that we knew that the group of families that we worked in the past would be vulnerable in the current situation because of the COVID shock. So what we did as a first step was within the team kind of understand what are the questions we wanted to ask of them. And our instinct was a duty of care. We said, can we kind of reach out to at least the initial representative sample from across all the states and see where the baseline is in terms of food security, access to health security, and access to economic security. This was in the wake of the stimulus package as well, the Prime Minister's Garib Kalyan Yojana. And what we did as the first step after framing the survey was to do kind of pilot calls across the team. So we are about 40 people. So all of us did about 10 calls each to kind of test out the questions for the principles that were outlined with CLIA. Are they actually the right questions to ask? What is the response like? What is the right time to call in? How do we ensure kind of diversity in terms of gender, in terms of respondents? Are there challenges with respect to kind of phone credit? So we tried to identify what are the different factors of exclusion in these surveys in the first run of pilot. And we kind of iterated and refined the questionnaire. So one big finding was, there was really early distress around food security. Majority of the challenge in the first few weeks of the lockdown was around access to food security. So we realized that just gathering that information was going to be, difficult for us. We were also feeling a sense of anxiety and distress that we were not being helpful, just kind of compiling a base estimate. So what we did parallelly was actually follow through with a smaller sample of 400, 500 families and ensure access to the helplines, the hunger helplines or the shelters that are available in different states. And we tested out the helpline information that was available either through kind of nonprofits or through kind of the state helplines. So we took the operational helplines and then created collateral. And so that served as kind of the starting point for the conversation. So our entry point into the conversation was an offer to understand kind of the baseline on these three elements of security: food, health, and economic security, and provide access to helpline information based on the needs. So that was kind of how we kind of tried to target. And as we did that, and we collected aggregate information on the access to these helplines. So we did follow through as well subsequently, whether, did they get access to rations? Did they get access to specific entitlements? And we started putting that together in a dashboard. So as we saw patterns, we went back to local authorities that we worked in the past with and tried to redress this at a systems level. And that's where we got kind of more interest from some of the district authorities to do rapid mini surveys for them as well, and some departments across states. So that was the second step. So iteratively, as we kind of finished calls in our own sample, we then started working with different state governments to construct M&E surveys for them and kind of employ the same approach, where collect baseline data, close the M&E loop, and offer access to helpline information, and continuously test those helplines for their efficacy as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tarun. So over to Shantanu from the National Council for Applied Economic Research. And Shantanu, can you discuss a little bit the concerns that you've had about exclusions of the most vulnerable groups, given that you were doing remote phone surveys? What was the non-response rate, and what did you learn from those non-response rates? And were there issues that you encountered in the midst of implementing your surveys that you hadn't fully thought through?
Yeah, hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks, Sunita. How to better target the right population, it would depend on the research objectives. I mean, if the research objective is to study a particular vulnerable population, which can be casual wage workers or labor migrants, urban poor, or domestic workers. I mean, some of the vulnerable groups we know that were most affected during this time. I mean, if the objective is to study a particular vulnerable population, then it is crucial to target that population, which essentially means that one needs to oversample that vulnerable population, because usually what happens in your population, the proportion of vulnerable group is going to be small. And whatever sample size you have, say around 2,000, 3,000, whatever, so you will never get enough representation of the vulnerable population in your sample. So that's why I think, so here by representation, I mean in the sense of absolute size of the sample, which is never going to be reasonable enough to draw any valid conclusion, valid inference about vulnerable population. So that's why I think oversampling of vulnerable population is crucial. And I mean, it's easier said than done, because in order to oversample the vulnerable population, you need to have that information, some distinguishing features available in your sampling frame, which would let you identify what is your vulnerable population. So, which is often not available. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but one needs to put that effort to ensure that those indicators are collected and part of the sampling frame, so that one can oversample the vulnerable population. I mean, the survey that Delberg has done, I mean, the low income population they have considered, and they have this information on the BPL status corresponding to each phone number. So those type of information is crucial if wants to oversample the vulnerable population. Now, coming back to our survey, Delhi NCR Coronavirus Telephone Survey, DCVTS. So we actually never have the objective of studying any specific vulnerable population. The goal was to understand the situation, what is happening in Delhi NCR, rather to find out who are most affected. So in a sense, to find out who are these vulnerable populations who are most affected. And so that's why what we tried to do to ensure that the sample we have, it kind of reflects the population and its characteristics of Delhi NCR. So the targeting of vulnerable population was never framed as an ethical concern before beginning the study. Now, coming back to the non-response part and what kind of exclusion it might have caused. So we have completed, actually now we have completed 3 rounds of our survey. So if we think of the first 2 rounds of our survey, DCVTS 1 and 2, I mean, they are of very different nature because of the way the sample was selected. So in round 1, what we have done, we have essentially followed up the same set of households which we have been following for the last 1 year or so. So those households have been surveyed for 3-4 rounds in the past. And that was part of another study, Delhi Metropolitan Area Study, and it was a face-to-face survey. So having a phone number or not was never the criteria of selecting that sample in the very beginning. So that way there is no exclusion as such. And also, since we have been following these households regularly and we have prior contact with them, we have their updated phone numbers. So we also were able to achieve a reasonably good response rate, about 77%. But there is a caveat here. So because this sample we have been following them over a period of time, and they are part of multiple rounds of surveys in the past. So there is some households are being dropped out at every round of the survey in the past. So that may lead to some sort of selectivity, and which may not happen at random. But usually, I mean, what our experience is that usually these dropouts are often, it's usually the urban rich households who are, or the members of the household who are very busy with work, etc. I mean, so the selectivity that is happening, I mean, that may not actually affect the objective of studying vulnerable population. I mean, so when we are interested in studying the impact of the pandemic, so dropping out of such households may not pose a challenge as such. So I mean, that's not necessarily, I mean, it's not a bad thing from a policy perspective given the current situation. But there is some sort of selectivity definitely is there, but that may not impact the current research objectives in this difficult situation. So now coming back to our second round sample, DCBTS2. So here what we have done, we went back to our original house listing data and selected a new sample, a new set of sample from that house listing data. Here, since this is a phone survey, we of course had to exclude households which did not have a phone number, which is actually quite a significant percentage. 18% households in our house listing data did not have phone number. But if we looked at it closely, then we realized that in more often than not, these are instances of households not willing to share phone numbers. Because, I mean, you know,
I want you to wrap up in 1 minute.
Because, I mean, during house listing, it's a very brief interaction. The household may not be willing to share, I mean, a lot of information, particularly phone numbers. And how do you know that 18% is largely due to the fact that they did not want to share phone number? Because in our DMAS sample, we have questions on the households having phone or not. From there, we know that only 2% of Delhi NCR household did not have any phone. So these are so it's difficult to comment on the exclusion without knowing the characteristics of the households who are not willing to share phone number. So that's a study we are undertaking separately to characterize this population. And also coming back to the non-response for DCBTS2, which is reasonably large, like we only have 64% response rate. But again, these response rate, the lower response rate is because of the fact that in 23% cases, we could not contact the household. Because the phone numbers were so dated, we couldn't contact the household. So that's, again, we don't know what type of household.
Yeah. We're going to come back to you. I think,
sure.
You know, throughout there are these issues around phone numbers and the fact that phone numbers change, etc. And that may be getting conflated with the issue that Tarun talked about, which is people may be running out of money to keep their phone numbers charged. But let me move over to Shweta from Dalberg, who is going to talk a little bit about the ways in which need for redressal came up in their survey. They also put a lot of thought into how to ask sensitive questions. And so, Shweta, I'd like for you to talk, to reflect on that experience as well of asking these sensitive questions.
Sure, thanks, Sunita. And also just wanted to say thank you to both Gates and the CoreNet team. I think one of the things that you've done really nicely is just keep making ethics a priority agenda item for all of us over the last few months. So huge thanks to you for that. Just in terms of support and redressal, you know, I think very early on in our study in early April, what happened was that one of our respondents actually expressed suicidal thoughts on an interview with us. And I'll share what we did in case it's helpful to you all. So one, we immediately abandoned agenda. 2, we roped in a team member who actually had experience supporting suicide helplines in the past. 3, we concluded the call immediately after the respondent said they were feeling calmer. That took 2 hours. And so the key here is that you don't cut the line while the respondent is speaking. Number 4, we shared helpline numbers that assist in suicide prevention. And number 5, like we actually checked in with the respondent over the next week. That incident was really a bit of a wake-up moment for us. And so what we did was we actually
sorry, can you speak a little bit louder and into your mic? People are having some trouble hearing you. Thanks.
Is this better?
Yeah, I think that's better.
Okay. So after that incident, what we did was we actually immediately revised our questionnaire script to include relevant numbers for all respondents. And we kind of tailored them to our respondents. And so for the current entitlement study that we've been doing, we offered a coronavirus relief and support numbers that were announced by the center and the state. We offered helplines for mental health specifically. And then when Cyclone Amphan hit, we actually also added a disaster relief helpline. And along the way, we learned a couple of best practices. So one is that you actually share the helpline both at the beginning and at the discussion. That way, if someone drops off, they've actually still gotten the helpline. And number 2, we've been using a standard script, and that's because not all enumerators are actually good at handling sensitive questions or sensitive situations equally. And so having that script actually minimizes accidental harm. And to this question of, have we thought about it before, we'd actually just begun discussing it internally, whether we should be adding helplines. But what happened was that this experience that we had actually just made very clear the urgency. And the helplines have really been important for us because the need for support, jobs, access to entitlement, someone to talk to, has actually been coming up pretty often, especially in the qualitative interviews that we've been doing. And actually here, I wanted to say thanks to Tharan and his team at In This Action. Actually, their helpline effort inspired ours, and they gave us some really helpful advice. And the reason I share that is because one of the big reflections for me has been how much the community needs to rely on and learn from each other right now. We kind of just don't have the time not to at the moment. Sunita, you also asked the question around how do we anticipate asking sensitive questions and what are some of the challenges we face? And so I guess, look, the way that we think about it is there's sensitivity in terms of content, phrasing, and delivery. I'll speak about content phrasing now, and then I'll come back to delivering in a minute for the next question. So with content, we have a few principles. So number 1, we avoid questions that we think can harm the respondent. So for example, we actually dropped questions on domestic violence for our upcoming gender survey. Number 2, we actually really try to focus on access to resources and solutions rather than further quantifying the problem where we can. And we really try to also emphasize additionality and asking no more than absolutely necessary. And to be honest, I think this is actually the hardest part for us. It's not always immediately obvious when we should be dropping a theme altogether, when we can or should quantify the problem, or when we really should be focused on driving at the solutions. And what I'll say here is that, we try to do our best, but we've also found that sometimes survey instruments aren't actually very good at identifying solutions. So it's kind of just tricky to do it. I think the other thing that's difficult is that, we actually work in service of our clients. And so what we find is sometimes we actually don't have the same opinion as our clients about what's okay to include. And there's some good things and bad things about it, but on balance, I think it creates a healthy tension. And then from a phrasing perspective, what we're really focused on is making sure that both questions and answer choices are really focused on the system rather than anything that can insinuate the respondent is at fault. And so I'll give an example, right, which is a question like, why did you deprioritize spending on menstrual pads? That's actually pretty loaded, right? It can both make a respondent feel like they're doing something wrong and just feel badly about themselves. And so we try to be really careful not to do that. And I guess the last thing I'd say is both across content and the phrasing, we make sure that we get multiple experts and researchers to review our questionnaires. NCAR did this just yesterday with us. We grapple with, they've grappled with similar themes, and then we also test our questions with respondents before we go live. And so we do some deep ethnographic research. And then finally, on the sensitive issues like gender, we're actually kind of making sure that we're going through IRB to triple check our efforts before we go live. Sunita, I know we had one more question. Do I have time to do that one, or should we come back to it? This was the one about vulnerability.
Hi, Sunita, I'm sorry, you're on mute.
Okay, why don't you take 1 minute, if you can do it in 1 minute.
I will do it as fast as I can. So the question
was
about...
Shweta, actually, to you,
people are feeling as a result of the lockdown, and do we think these questions can cause vulnerabilities? Look, the way that we think about it is actually some framing. And so I see marginalization and vulnerability often used interchangeably. And I guess my personal view is that, you may be part of a marginalized group, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're vulnerable, and vice versa. And I think when we say that all marginalized people are vulnerable, that sometimes can actually erase their agency, even when we mean to treat them with dignity. And like one of the things that we've seen just over the years is that many respondents actually are grateful to have someone to talk to about what's on their mind and share their concerns. And we feel that those views are important to elevate. But all that said, I think the question actually still holds. And I think there's some real questions and genuine questions about interviewing individuals who are part of marginalized groups. And sometimes questions can cause vulnerabilities if not asked in the right way. And so I think there's a few things that we try to do. Number one, we really differentiate between what we ask in a survey that's conducted by enumerators versus what we ask ourselves as part of longer qualitative interviews. So the bar for what makes it into an enumerator-based survey is just much higher. And for our current study, we actually didn't ask people how they feel because of the lockdown. But even our qualitative research is designed to probe less on how people feel, because we don't want to cause vulnerabilities, but more to understand how are people coping and what are their workarounds. We also find that tends to be a bit more actionable. And so the other thing I would say is that sometimes conversations actually do become personal. And so what we do to ensure that they don't turn intrusive is we do a few things. One is we're really, really careful about how we set tone. And what I mean is that we explain there's no right or wrong answer. All answers are anonymized so that the interviewee can end the conversation at any time. We take a lot of time explaining consent. Sometimes that's anywhere between 5 and 30 minutes to make sure that people know what they're consenting to. We revisit consent throughout the interview, and we check in on participants, for example, when they take a long pause or when they reiterate choice points throughout the conversation. Number 4, we have interview guides, but we don't follow a script, especially during our qualitative interviews. That way we can navigate the conversation, just make sure the interviewee is feeling heard and cared for. And number 5, I would say, and this is important for all of us, is that there's objective ways to gauge discomfort, even over the phone. And I think what we've seen is that, when an interviewee is giving one-word answers, that's like a pretty clear sign, like we need to back off and just stop. And so I guess in sum, my view is it's okay to have a personal conversation if it's done the right way, but it's just never okay to have an intrusive conversation. And I'll stop here. And the only other thing I would say is that really welcome suggestions on what more and better we can do. I think that, the questions that we're discussing today, frankly, are the ones that keep me and many of my team members up at night as well. And so really welcome suggestions.
Thanks so much, Shweta. I think you offered us a number of really practical suggestions that I think we should revisit when we pull all this together. So over to Dr. Soumyajulu, who is CEO as well as the head of the Sigma IRB. So he's a member of an research ethics committee. So Soumyajulu, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the concerns and dilemmas that you've encountered in the IRB protocols, the research ethics protocols that you've reviewed over the last 3 months, and what kinds of suggestions or recommendations have you made to address some of those dilemmas?
Yeah, thank you, Sunita. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. See, I think I have certain concerns related to the ethical aspects of the research, particularly when we are talking about online surveys and telephonic surveys. I think there was a comment from Subrato Mandal also. He has a valid point there. I agree with him on that point. See, first of all, I think Shantanu mentioned about the process, saying that, out of the N number of, sample that was covered in the earlier rounds, N1 number had the telephone number, so they considered them as the sampling frame and all. Here the issue is that before we start taking the consent and other activities, we should call them and get their consent to be contacted for consent. I think that first step has to happen. The moment they say that yes, your person or you can call me in this regard, then only we can go ahead. I think that is one missing link in the entire process, and this has been a major concern we have been facing in the last 2 to 3 months when we are talking about the telephonic surveys and all. That was number 1 point. Number 2 is the privacy and the confidentiality of the data and the interview surroundings and all. That was another issue. If it is a face-to-face or one-to-one interview, you always have the opportunity to observe the body language of the respondent, observe the environment, within the household and see the response of the other members and all. In case of telephonic interviews, we have a major challenge in this regard. I think we need to address this aspect as well, particularly if we are talking about some of the sensitive aspects. This would be more challenging and this would be more important for the research team to have some information about this. How to get it, we have to discuss and find out some way forward for this. And the another related aspect is the interview time. How much time we are taking from each respondent for the telephonic interviews, because it has a bearing on the quality as well as the ethical aspects and privacy and confidentiality and other aspects of the survey. I think that also has to be taken into account. And then another related aspect is, I think Priya mentioned it in her initial remarks, is the emotions. You know, how are we going to face the challenge relating to the emotional reactions of the respondents, particularly if you are talking about the vulnerable groups. I think Shantanu mentioned about the coverage of vulnerable groups in the survey. So in that case, what kind of emotional aspects we had to handle with, and then how did we handle that? That also, you know, needs to be understood. I think these are some of course, another point is the not only from the ethical aspect, even from the inference aspect, that Shantanu made a brief mention of these aspects. One is that, you know, you don't have the telephone number of n number of people out of your total sample. So if you can prepare a comparative profile of those people who have phone number, those who do not have phone number, and the third set could be those people who have the phone number but you are not able to reach them due to various reasons. So you have three sets of you know, your sample, three groups of three subsets of the sample. So if you can just do a comparative analysis in terms of profile and other responses from the earlier rounds, and then you can assess the kind of impact you may think of excluding certain sections of the sample from the telephonic survey on the results. You know, that kind of analysis can be attempted to get some kind of idea about the kind of influence the sampling will have on the results of the survey. I think these are my initial you know, remarks and concerns.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me, before we kind of start to look at the questions that have been put into the chat stream, let me turn over to Nicola, just to make a few comments and observations, particularly from your perspective and the practices that you've been engaged with at UNICEF.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sunita and Priya. So kind of listening to this speakers summarize how what has been shared also relates to the work we do at UNICEF. And as you know, UNICEF's primary population of interest are children. So that itself is a vulnerable population, and within that, many subsections which are even more vulnerable. So ethics and research ethics, it's at the forefront of what we do. And, you know, Priya, it's great that you started with the Belmont Principles, because that really always needs to be the foundation. So when approaching research, we often use the saying of protection with inclusion, and that goes for all research, and we also try to apply it during COVID. So under protection, the principle that we are using the most at the moment is do no harm. So making sure that whatever research we commission has the potential to benefit children, not just to do it as an exercise of finding out what might be interesting. There has to be clear usage and use. And then a lot of the things the speakers shared, for example, Shweta from Dalberg was talking about the importance of asking sensitive questions in a way that may not re-traumatize, having protocols in place, you know, providing that information of where people can go for help, taking limited privacy into account. So for example, one of the things that we have introduced as a rule of thumb, so currently we are doing only remote data collection. There is, until further notice, we will not be doing any face-to-face in India under COVID. But for example, a rule of thumb is to ask no questions about violence over the phone, because you cannot control what is there and how children or women, for that matter, could be victimized because of that. So having a lot of safeguards in place to ensure protection, to ensure confidentiality, and also have protocols in place to provide helpline numbers and so on, so that children can participate safely. But then there is the aspect of inclusion as well. So often, you know, when working with children, we can get stressed and we may want to go to the parent as a proxy rather than including them and having their voices heard. And again, under COVID, when children are isolated and at home, actually including them and having their voices heard is extremely important as well. So where this can be done safely, that would be something that we would encourage. And, you know, with technology, young people are often savvy with that. So inclusion with protection would be the way to go. And some, again, kind of rules of thumbs around ethical ways of doing that is to obviously always ask for informed consent and assent from the children as well. And to have some hopeful questions on there as well, because researching the COVID situation, it's all doom and gloom, but maybe there are some things that, you know, are positive. So can we ask that to also help to lift the mood? Can we ask what do you hope to do once this situation is over, to engage children in that more kind of hopeful thinking? And when I say children with this, I'm thinking more adolescents, because remote data collection with younger children would be more difficult. And of course, using that data collection mechanism as a way to be able to share information about what may be safe practices, what helpline phone numbers are, and so on. So I'll leave it there as some of the examples of best practices. I can share links to lots of interesting papers on this for those who are interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicola. I think the emphasis on doing no harm is really, really important to keep reminding ourselves of that and sort of applying that as the key sort of frame through which we look at everything we do. So there are a couple of questions. Let me take one from Sonalde. Sonalde asks, how do we balance the length of the interview, which may increase anxiety and impose time burden, which some of the panelists did talk about, with ensuring that respondents get all the time that they need to understand the purpose of the work, you know, for them to ask maybe any questions that they have. So is there an optimal survey size? Shweta, you talked about this a little bit, but I wonder if you want to give a response. Like in the surveys that you've done, how many questions have you posed? Typically, how long is the survey itself? And about how long, what's the range in terms of the consent process?
Yeah, and I'll answer it thanks, Sunita, and I'll answer it in two ways, because I think large-scale surveys are very different from the qualitative interviews. And the honest truth is I think it's easier from a qualitative interview perspective than the large-scale survey in terms of having like deeply informed consent. And why I say that is because our qualitative interviews are really, really led by the respondents. And so those conversations tend to be anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half, but that's by and large because the respondent who has to do so. And therefore we can spend, you know, however long they need on consent and making sure they're really comfortable with what we're asking and revisiting the topic, etc. And if we end up spending a long time on consent, then actually we just cut the themes and kind of, you know, cut the rest of the topics that we're trying to dig into in order to make space for what's most important to them. It's a bit harder with the kind of larger scale surveys. And so we try really, really hard not to keep those surveys more than 17 to 19 minutes in length, which is kind of our understanding of like what's gold standard for, you know, being mindful of people's time, especially over a phone survey, which means we get to ask a max about 50 or so questions, of which 10 go to demographics. And so there we'll probably, you know, have informed consent stuff around 2 minutes, I would say, and then about a minute at the very end that goes to the helplines, right? And also the helplines at the beginning. So that's kind of, I would say, roughly what we go for. But as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the things that's really important and what makes a strong enumerator is actually kind of being able to listen to those verbal cues. And from our perspective, it's actually okay if an interview needs to be terminated or we need to drop the data or only use part of it for whatever reason. And we also try to just check in on those interviews every so often just to get a sense of kind of how are the conversations going.
Thanks. Did you, just to clarify, did you say 50 questions, 50? 50,
yeah, that gets us to about 17 to 19 minutes, yeah.
Okay, great.
200 gets us to 16 minutes, 50 gets us to...
Yeah. Tarun, any reflections on that question from your experience?
Yes, Sunita. I mean, just building on what was shared, we tested out kind of the time duration of the surveys in the initial 400, 500 calls, and we kind of arrived at an outer limit of 15 minutes, and kind of the bound was 10 to 15 minutes. So if anything beyond 10, we were kind of realizing that it was getting stressful, and probably we were getting a lot of acquiescent answers as well. Because people were respondents were looking to kind of close the survey, and you could sense that. So yeah, we tried to at the max, if at 10 minutes, kind of take a pulse check. If we could extend 5 more minutes, but otherwise 15 minutes was the outer bound for us. Yeah.
Great. So here's a question that I wanted to pose. Okay, so we have a question around how well proxy questions might be used or work for asking sensitive issues. And I'm wondering, Shantanu, if you have discussed or used sort of proxy questions to get at more sensitive topics.
Yeah, so in our DCVTS, we hardly have any sensitive question. Only one sensitive question we asked regarding increase in tension in the family. I mean, not only from this survey, in the past also, one thing we noticed that adding couple of introductory sentence to set up the context often helps in asking the question as opposed to jumping to the question abruptly. I mean, I don't know that would lead to better quality data or not, but it's easy to implement. Also, the interviewers feel much more comfortable in asking that question that way. So I'll just read out the question we have in DCVTS and how we asked it. So these days, everybody is stuck in the house. In some households, it may lead to increased fights among adult members. In your household, has there been an increase or decrease or no change in such incidents compared to the life before lockdown? So basically, there's one or two introductory sentence helps because anyway, these type of questions over phone, as everyone mentioned, is very difficult to ask. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I think Shweta also mentioned the importance of sort of introducing questions, framing questions, you know, as a way to kind of take also the heat off the question in a sense. Let me throw a question back at you, Shantanu, and then I'm going to move to the others. What's the best way to monitor phone surveys? Unlike field surveys, you can't accompany enumerators into the field. So how do you know how well the interviews have been operationalized?
Yeah, so they definitely have other ways of doing it. I mean, one option could be recording, etc., with the consent of the respondent, which we haven't done. What we have done, just to make sure that the interviewers are actually calling to the households, we have verified all the call records from interviewers' phone. I mean, we used to ask them at the end of the day so to share their call records with us so that we can match the sample IDs and the phone numbers that we have shared with them. Those have actually been called. So that's a very basic level of monitoring, but I think that's very crucial that actually the data is coming from the respondents. And of course, I mean, the training or other things plays a crucial role. Yeah, that's all. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to send that question over to Tarun. Any specific ways in which you monitored the quality of your interviews?
Right, Sunita. So one was initially we would kind of call back and a random sample and kind of check on the data that was collected. But that became details at the volume of calls that we were doing. As in the subsequent kind of calls, we looked at the first level at the data, and we would then kind of call back and kind of verify just data fields which kind of seemed out of sync. So those were the process we had. We did discuss the process of possibly audio recording the calls and then having kind of auditing systems in place. But we couldn't execute that. Yeah.
Shweta, any comment from you? I know that you work with a separate agency that does the data collection for you.
Yeah, so we do a couple of things. So one, we are fully embedded in the numerator training, and we really participate in that extent. And so we try to help and share two things. One is that they themselves really understand the questions and understand the sensitivities, and just we help them along that journey. And two, we also try to emphasize the importance of kind of the script and kind of what we're trying to achieve as part of the numerator training. And then once the numerator training is actually done, we make it part of our regular protocol to help to join in on some of those conversations, just to see how they're going. And we kind of do that regularly on an ongoing basis and get feedback and just kind of help identify where we're seeing issues and where there's opportunity for improvement. I think the other thing that I would say is we're also very grateful. We have a great partner in Kantar Public, and it's what the ethics and kind of how interviews are being done is something that they also take pretty seriously, and so they have some pretty robust back-end data collection efforts that they do just to test, how is the interview going, etc. And so it's like, I think when we bring both of our forces together, it brings the best of both of our organizations, and we kind of jointly prioritize this. I think we could also do more, to be totally honest, right? And I think one of the things that we're grappling with is how do we push even further, especially as we enter into some of those studies that we think are going to be more sensitive in nature than our first one.
Okay, I'm going to take two last questions and then we're going to wrap this up. One is any advice, let me send this over to Shantanu first. Any advice on how to reduce non-response in phone surveys? Shantanu, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah, I wish there is a solution for this. Someone is writing S, as you indicated at the beginning. But see, the key is, I think, some of the points that Dr. Soumya Julu also mentioned. The key is to find out the characteristics of the respondents and the non-respondents. I mean, if they're similar, I mean, then there is not much to worry because that non-response may not lead to any bias. So that's something we have to try to do in all the surveys, just to characterize the non-respondents and the respondents. And the reason for exclusion can be various reasons. I mean, it can be not having a phone, it can be not willing to share phone, it can be, for many reasons, not only, one specific reason. So a different type of exclusion and dropouts, if we can characterize them, so that would help us understanding the magnitude of the bias because of this phenomenon. Yeah.
Okay, so one question to Soumya Julu. From an IRB perspective, how would you recommend researchers address the issue of, the telephone conversations sort of meandering into issues that perhaps the IRB had not been made aware of? So it could be that, respondents brought up issues that hadn't been anticipated, and the researcher sort of needs to respond, but these are not issues that necessarily were agreed upon with the IRB.
Yeah, I think, see, from the IRB and from the ethical point of view, In fact, I want to know from Shantanu and Tarun and others, about the quality of the responses. Did we see any difference in the quality of responses because of the method of data collection? And if it is so, then it would have a bigger impact on the overall outcome of the study itself. So that could be one area that needs to be looked into. What Shantanu mentioned about the non-response and all, that is one aspect, and this is the second aspect. And then, of course, I was concerned about the interview time, and then Tarun mentioned that it is about 10 to 15 minutes. I was not sure how much was the interview time in case of the NCAR surveys, because that would also have some kind of influence on the outcome of the survey, particularly the quality of the data. And then coming to the specific ethical aspects, I also want to know about what is the proportion of respondents who did not give the consent. Suppose you contacted 100 people to give the consent for the telephonic survey. Out of 100, how many have said yes, and how many have given the consent, and how many have said no, I am not interested in to participate in the survey? I think that kind of information also would be more useful for the for the research agency to analyze that. I think another related aspect is about the sensitive questions. I think Sunita, you asked this question, and then the panelists responded the way they handled it and all. Specifically, if you take a few sensitive questions and see the responses we are getting, is there any certain trend which is not expected, or is it is it in accordance with the expected trend? Some kind of analysis can be done on this, so that we get more insights about the pattern of the responses over a section of the respondents. I think these are some of the aspects. And then I also want to know specifically about the specific ethical approaches that were adopted by the various agencies for the telephonic surveys.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm going to actually start to wrap this up. Do any of the other panelists have a burning sort of issue or comment that they want to make in literally 30 seconds? Okay. Thank you so much. There are a few pending. Okay, go for it.
I think one of the biggest questions that we've been grappling with is, as researchers, what is our primary goal? Is it to problematize issues that have already been problematized when we don't actually need additional data to know that something is an issue, versus actually really focusing on solutions and identifying workarounds and what to do and what next, and actually asking respondents about what they need? And so that's been one of our biggest guiding principles, because the point of our research is actionability, right? As opposed to just finding data for data's sake. And so if that's correct, then actually in some cases we actually do not need to understand the impact, because actually we know that the impact is pretty severe already. So that's something that we're really grappling with and encourage others to think about too, if you're not already.
Thanks, Shweta. I think that's a really important point, but a really difficult one to operationalize. Shantanu, do you have a 30-second comment?
Yeah, just to answer a couple of questions of Dr. Soumya Julie. So first about the refusal.
Shantanu, I don't think we have a lot of time. So
okay.
In 30 seconds, if you can.
Okay. Yeah. So just 5% is the actual refusal. The most of the non-response comes from the non-contact. Okay. So that's one thing. And regarding data quality, it's difficult to compare because the type of service we are doing now is very different than what we have done using face-to-face service. Yeah.
Great. And Dr. Soumya, there are a couple of questions in the chat stream. It would be great if you can answer them, particularly around the timeliness of IRB reviews, and maybe you could provide some information to the folks gathered here today on how long it takes for the Sigma IRB to review proposals, and how many proposals you're reviewing per week, and that kind of thing. I think it'll be really helpful for folks to hear. So in terms of I think this panel's been fantastic with Indus Action. Tarun highlighted the fact that their research has really come from this from a sense of a duty of care. There's a population that they are attempting to serve and to support, and they have made it a point to take the data that they're collecting from people, to follow up with people to ensure and track that the problems that they're facing are actually getting solved, and also to connect with local administration. And I think that was really interesting, because the reporting and outreach to local administration seems to have also fostered a demand for more data of this kind, so that local administrations can themselves monitor and assess how well they're doing. Shantanu talked about being really clear about the objective of your research. And if you already know who might be vulnerable, then you might need to oversample and really attempt to reach those groups. Alternatively, in their case, they were really trying to understand and kind of understand the landscape of vulnerability. But he did acknowledge that it's important to really think about who is dropping out. Sort of, if you're doing multiple rounds of surveys over time, there may be underlying reasons associated with vulnerability that is causing people to drop out over time, and that is something to track. Shweta shared with us a number of very practical things that they have done to address the ethical concerns that they've faced, including avoiding straight up questions that are very sensitive, focusing on access to resources and solutions rather than quantifying problems, repeating and reminding participants of the conditions under which they've consented, the fact that they've consented to participate, so that you offer multiple opportunities if people are getting fatigued to drop out of the interview. Dr. Soumyajulu talked about various concerns that IRBs are thinking about and looking at as they review protocols. And Nicola underscored the importance of the principle of do no harm. And so with that, let me bring the first panel to a close and hand over to Priya.
Hi.
All good. We can hear you and see you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sunita. That was really very interesting discussion. And I think what's going to happen as we move into the next panel, all of these issues remain, but we are going to talk about specific vulnerabilities and disadvantages that relate to trying to unpack issues of gender inequalities, differential impacts of COVID on women and girls, or thinking of women as respondents, women as frontline workers, women in the household or the community as respondents to these to the phone surveys that we've designed in various studies. So in this panel, we're going to start with our first panelist. Okay, the same rules apply. If you have particular points of view or questions, use the chat. And if you want to offer a particular solution, use the letter S so that we can identify it as a solution and just actively engage on the chat. So our first panelist is Rashmi Abula and IFPRI. Rashmi is they're still yet to field their studies. So the question to you was, in putting together your IRB protocol, because your population is women with infants or young children and frontline workers, in putting together your IRB, what were specific kinds of ethical considerations that might have been different that you were addressing or thinking of or being confronted with? And the second is particularly experiences of IFPRI with some of your other colleagues around protecting privacy of respondents on mobile surveys. So over to you, 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Priya, and thanks, Sunita, for organizing a discussion on such an important topic. And thank you for making me a part of it. I think it is important that we have these discussions and continue to have them even when we go back to in-person interviews. So I'll respond to your questions in the context of a study our team at IFPRI is actually preparing for to field. And the study is about identifying frontline worker adaptations to health and nutrition services with a focus on positive adaptations. And this goes back to what Shweta was mentioning about trying to find solutions. And that's the approach we are taking here. Given the COVID pandemic, services have been disrupted and the service modalities have changed. And anecdotes started emerging on how the frontline workers are adapting to these new service modalities. So we wanted to understand how prevalent these adaptations are across geographies. So our primary respondents in this case are frontline workers, and some of the things that we have been thinking about relate to representativeness. I don't think this is unique to our study in any way. There are many phone surveys being conducted and all are grappling with this issue. The context from which I'm talking about is how do we achieve representativeness of geographies that frontline workers are working in, whether we'll be able to represent our urban, rural, tribal areas appropriately, because the adaptations they would be making could be very specific to these geographies. And how do we know we're capturing a representative sample from that perspective? So, and because it will all depend on phone contacts that we can get. And that brings me to the concept of how will we get frontline worker phone numbers. We have to go through the state officials to speak, to get permissions to get to their frontline workers and get their phone numbers from them as well. So we were wondering about what kind of bias will we be introducing, given that we are actually approaching the officials to get the phone numbers. Finally, we have to tell frontline workers that we got the permission from their supervisors to speak with them, and we got the phone numbers. So we do not know if the frontline workers will feel obligated to tell us, to speak with us first of all, and then will they feel compelled to tell us positive stories only. As our intent is to understand positive adaptations, we thought, well, if we do end up hearing only positive stories and the best experiences, potentially that's the best possible scenario that exists out there. It will not be representative, but it will be indicative. So we have to proceed with what we are trying to document. The next aspect that comes is how do we assure confidentiality and privacy, particularly because now we have to tell the frontline workers that we got these phone numbers from your supervisors, and will they be, how comfortable will they be feeling to talk to us? They may be compelled to speak, but that is not ethical on our part to get that going. So one of the aspects that we thought is we'll emphasize during the informed consent process that they do not have to speak to us if they do not want to. And that's something we plan to emphasize. Perhaps it will be actually easier for them to say no because it is over a phone. And usually when we show up at an Anganwadi center or a sub-center, they feel compelled to speak with us because now you have showed up there. That is when we think of the frontline workers' confidentiality and privacy. If we think about the women, that poses a whole lot of issues, right? If we think of interviewing women in UP rural areas, of course that woman doesn't have the ability to walk out and take the phone call. And we don't know if they will be asked to put on speaker when we are talking about any of the questions. Recently, a colleague of mine shared a survey that they have done, and what they found is over 65% of women in their study actually were on speakerphone when they were responding. So we can assure privacy from not revealing who they are, but when they are speaking, there is no privacy from that concept, from that perspective. The next thing that we grappled with is the length of the questionnaire. We know that it has to be between 15 to 20 minutes. Now with that time length, what kind of questions can we ask? So we did a prioritization exercise to ensure that we got a broad view of what we wanted to know and thought will be useful for programmatic actions in the immediate future. And then we are hoping to conduct multiple rounds of data collection, potentially using methods other than surveys to learn more from the frontline workers. And one of the aspects that I really grappled with at a personal level was whether to include a mental health module or not. we know that the frontline workers are under tremendous stress at this point. They are working 10 to 12 hours, they're being stigmatized and whatnot. So how do we understand their stress and mental health status? However, without actually being able to link them to any services, it didn't seem ethical to actually include that particular module in the survey that we are planning. So we discussed internally with several other colleagues, and we are talking to some experts also how to deal with this. But for now, we said, let's not include it. And I would love to hear from our audience and other panelists if they have included mental health modules in their studies and how they dealt with it.
Thanks, Roshni.
And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, your time is up. I'll come back to you, hopefully. So we're going to move on. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. We're going to pick up these issues as we go along further into our next conversation, which is with Pranita from ICRW.
Hi, thank you, Priya.
So yeah, Pranita, we obviously with ICRW, for decades you've been doing work on gender issues and looking at gender-based vulnerabilities in all your research. But this is a particular moment of moving to mobile where you don't have RAPO and you don't have that assurance of the context and understanding of the context of your respondents. So could you speak about how did you address some of these gender vulnerabilities? What did you anticipate and how did you address them in your IRB? And specifically the issue of preventing backlash for women and girls in participating in surveys. Thanks, Pranita.
Yeah, thank you, Priya. So I'll just go little further back. And as a research, being part of a research organization, I think for me, the biggest critical ethical dilemma is how the research is going to address some of the most immediate and worsening need of the vulnerable population. And right now we are talking about from the perspective of women and girls. And I think one of the speakers has spoken about this, that it's not just about understanding the ground reality, but using the understanding to then inform programming. So it's all about that. One side, as a research process, we should have a strong referral and system support for the participants. But I think at the same time, it's very crucial to have a very short turnaround time to ensure that those findings are being used to address concerns and issues on which the research has been conducted without really compromising the quality and integrity of research. And towards that, what we realize that having key stakeholders who are involved in designing, executing, data use, being on board from the word go becomes very crucial. So like in one of our research work, we really engaged with district authority to even design the research. What are the key questions that are important for them to address the program or respond to the needs of women and girls in the community? And also having a local partner as part of the process really enabled us to understand the ground reality, to connect with women and girls, to take these questions further. And I'll get back to these points again. Another big question which came up about the mental health issues, and we all know and recognize that it's very gendered. And probably right now it requires much more attention than probably any time earlier. And in fact, going without serious preparation to address or be sensitive towards the question or the issues that we are really researching on has a huge ethical concerns. And we had some discussion in the earlier session, and that really remains important and pertinent for this session as well. Alongside also the mental stress and the vulnerability or the vulnerable situation that the interviewers may find themselves, because this stressing situation is for like probably everyone in maybe in different severity, but that's also very crucial and important for all of us to consider, that the people who are engaged in the research activities, especially those who are doing the interviews and holding discussion, how they are coping or what support we are providing them to cope with the stress and the pressure they may be feeling at this right time. And in that complex scenario, remote data collection adds a layer of complexity and concern. What we have felt that, access and control over phone, comfort with technology, for what purpose a woman and girl can actually use phone, for how long, it's very gendered. And there is also a lot of this question that happens that, as a research organization or researchers, how are we accessing the phone? Like, were people whose phone number we are using for research, did they get opportunity to decide whether they want their phone to be used for the research purpose or not? So that remains an important and crucial question in terms of ethical issues. Linked with that also is the whole research burden in terms of time, issues that we are considering, how important that issue is for the population with whom we are doing the research. And there are certain already existing evidence in terms of that how women and girls are already burdened with unpaid care. There are other issues, they are coping with that. And in that context, what we felt that the having a local partner who have like really good understanding of the geography where we are doing the work helps not only in terms of designing the study, but also in terms of executing the research. Especially what we have seen that, having a discussion around recruitment strategy, how when women and girls may be available to talk about when they have some lean period. Also, there's this whole issue and question around, how long the consent and assent form should be, so that they understand the whole program and make a whole study and make an informed decision, but also in terms of time it requires for them to make that decision. And in that, what we felt that moving some of those detailing in the recruitment script actually helps a lot, and also gives time to the participant in terms of whether they want to participate or not participate at what time. So that we felt really works pretty well.
Pranita,
just
your
last
time is over, so we're going to come back. Lots of really important issues that we haven't heard before that you've surfaced. So thank you so much. I'm taking notes, and we'll come back to these. Hopefully, we'll get a rapid fire in this section. The next speaker is Priya Das from OPM. And Priya is actually going to talk about digital ethnographies that they've been doing. In their particular case, they had already been doing ethnographies with a population of facility providers and then pivoted to digital. So you have that case, Priya, and then you also have new mobile numbers that you have with community members. So it's where you didn't have existing app. So can you talk a little bit with working with facility level providers, women? How do you ensure privacy, confidentiality? There's no backlash. The importance of rapport, because you have these two scenarios, and generally gender implications of interviewing your respondents as providers who are in the lowest rung of the health system hierarchy. Over to you, Priya.
Thank you, Priya. In the interest of time, I'll just kind of move fast on this. So like Priya mentioned, so we have been working with 2 facilities in 2 districts in Bihar, and we've known all the stakeholders within a CFC setting for the last, from August 2019. And we anyway were sort of communicating with them on phone when we used to be off field, even pre-COVID. And when the fieldwork was not possible, we moved on to we moved on to the telephonic platform. So in that sense, there was already a sort of very well established rapport in that sense, and the core interview team sort of has a personal rapport with most of them. In terms of privacy, what we found was that it was actually, they had more privacy over a telephonic medium because we only spoke in their time of choosing, like whatever time they chose, and it was actually outside of the institutional setting much more. And they were way more open in sharing than they actually did when we were doing the research real time. So that's on the issue of privacy. In terms of confidentiality, of course, we had the IRB clearance for the whole ethnographic study, and we sort of very, very seriously pursued that protocol. We don't share the names of districts or facilities, anything. We don't attribute information to individuals. But when we started to sort of continue it over phone, and we realized that there was an interesting point around confidentiality, because clearly they are all health providers. The process has been very, very intense on the ground. A lot of legacy issues around, systemic constraints, corruption, not being prioritized, etc., not having PPE was happening on the ground. And actually the providers spoke a lot and spoke very openly and taking names, etc. So we actually had to filter out in our sort of presenting of any data, we actually filter out a lot of those very specific, even if they don't ask us not to talk about it. It's funny that during this process, it was almost, there was an urgency for their voices to be heard, and none of them told us not to share some information. But we took that decision to filter out a lot of specifics, but make sure that we kind of in the best possible and abstracted way present the core issues with the people that really mattered in this case. So that was in terms of sort of the confidentiality bit. We were very, very aware. So the structural gender inequities within the health system, specifically to do with ANMs and ASHAs, is not something that is new to us. So we were very, very aware. But one thing that we were very particular about, and that's why we sort of work with a very core team within OPM who are trained, who've been trained repeatedly, to make the experience of interaction one a positive one, and not have any questions that are confirmatory about the subordination position. So we don't ask specific questions around, did you get PPE, did you not have, what is it like for you? So keeping the questions sort of much more sort of generic, making sure in our analysis that we, even though we might not have immediate solutions to some of these issues, that we sort of raise them repeatedly till, one kind of starts beginning to sort of start paying attention to it, and to make sure that without taking names, using positions, generic positions, we are able to sort of, bring to focus what is important. Like Pranita said, at the end of the day, the research that we are doing has to have a relevance and return somewhere within the system to the particular individuals that we are sort of using as a respondent or talking to. So that was, and also we took a very gendered frame because, the COVID-19 situation, there were very overwhelming generic issues around all sorts of concerns, but to be very particular that you're not presenting or your analysis or understanding in a generic way, but actually lensing your analysis very, very specific to the gender issues that are coming up. So that's largely around the facility ethnography. We are positioning ourselves to do some community-based interviews. And so for that, we are partnering with a local organization, and we are actually, we've just done a feasibility kind of assessment one round, and we are actually sort of getting the numbers, etc., through the partner organizations who have been working with these women for a very, very long time. So there are two layers of consent that we'll be seeking. One is when the partner organizations only give us number for women who agree to speak, and then we have a second layer of consent where during our first sort of interaction with them, we take consent. We don't do the interview the same time, one time. We first call to take consent, where we take 15, 20, 30 minutes, whatever it takes, to explain the whole process. And only if they consent and they understand do we call again, and that too at a time of their choosing. And to just overall also to state that, that in these times and in these vulnerabilities of all kinds, where as researchers we are limited, and the referrals, etc. I think one thing,
just your last point, please.
The point is to really look at ethics in practice and keep 3 key principles operational, whether it is written or not written, formal or not formal. One is to have complete empathy, putting the respondent at the center of your research. 2 is to do very affirmative inquiry, not to sort of, to appreciate a lot more whatever it is that is being said, or they're appreciating themselves and their work on those issues. And I think these 2 points about affirmative inquiry and empathy is what we really sort of instill in our core group of researchers.
Thanks, Priya. Thanks a lot, Priya. Sorry to interrupt. We got the point, and very important points that you and Pranita made around focusing, centering on the population and their needs. And secondly, really affiliating with a local organization that is embedded in the community, which then actually takes me to my last panelist, Paramita Sen, who is at Seva Bharat. And what I loved about this example is that they are embedded in the community, and their research is being designed by the community and being executed by members of Seva in the community. And they have set up their own community-based review board that she will talk about. So, Paramita, 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Priya. Thanks, everybody. I realize I'm the last speaker, so I'll be brief and precise. Seva, I don't know how many of you know, but Seva is a trade union. We have of women in the informal economy, and we work across many states. We have 18 lakh members across 17 states. But given that Seva is a trade union, that essentially means, and we work at different state levels, it is basically meant that Seva has a very decentralized approach to everything that it does, and that has trickled down to research as well. So research also follows a very similar decentralized model, where we work right at the hyper-local level to figure out what research is needed by the community and how can we as researchers support those needs. So researchers and writers work in tandem with communities to generate the questions, the hypotheses, figuring out samples and methodologies that will work in the field. And then once those have come, that ideational step, the community comes in with all of that. And then the research team will do the work, right? So we figure out how to write it, we figure out how to do the rigor, maintain research rigor and methodological rigor, and make sure we're not violating spillover effects and all of that. But we really try to focus on co-designing the research with community stakeholders. We don't have a traditional IRB process. The research team at Seva is new, even though we're building on about 4 decades of research history within Seva, but the research team as a separate team is new. So we are in the process of trying to set up a formal IRB process. But essentially, even within that formal IRB process, we would like to draw on what has informally been happening so far. We just want to build and institutionalize this model. As of right now, what happens when a research project is going to be started, or the need comes from the community, or we identify a need from the head office, is a research proposal is put together. We work on the proposal, the idea, the question, in collaboration with some of the key members of the stakeholder communities. And then this process, and then that proposal, the design, the instruments, the samples, all of this is reviewed by a group of evolving people, but it essentially composed of researchers, internal and external, union representatives, so Seva leaders, whose job it is to safeguard the interests of women in the informal economy, and then most importantly, the community members and stakeholders. This work is, again, as I mentioned, so these are the people who generally consist of our internal review process. These people will keep changing. So for instance, if we're working with domestic workers, then we work with a domestic worker who runs her own collective, who runs a collective social enterprise, a Seva leader who works on domestic worker organizing, and then external researchers, internal researchers, and say the president of Seva Bharat.
Arumita, sorry,
yes.
since the time is less, can you speak to mobile surveys that you're now
yes.
designing with this model? Thanks.
Perfect. Absolutely. Sorry. So this is the process
that's
made. Through COVID, through this lockdown, however, our team has usually just been the one to go into the field and do this. Obviously not a possibility for us right now. So what we've ended up doing is we've been training our community members themselves. So because of this lockdown, many of these women are out of jobs themselves, right? We've been trying to figure out how to do livelihood regeneration for them from the union perspective. And we figured that research and data collection is something these women can do themselves. So we've trained these women on how to use Google Forms and Kobo Toolbox. Many of these women, we design the instrument, and then these women give us feedback on the instrument. We work with these communities of data collectors who give us feedback on the instrument, help us get it translated into ways that will be easy to collect information. Like what is the colloquial language, the colloquial terms that I used, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. So they help with the translation, they help with the instrument design, and then we do the technical work of uploading it. And then these women do the calling themselves. And they collect the data, it gets entered in. And then these women do reflection groups. The groups of data collectors do reflection groups with one of the researchers, and also draw in observations that weren't reflected in the survey, but they understood through the conversation with their fellow informal economy workers. We've realized for us that there is a training curve, right? There's a learning curve trying to get these women to learn that. So there was a little bit of a learning curve for us there, and it still is. But we found that the conversation just happened to be a lot richer when it's a woman from the informal economy talking to another woman from the informal economy. There's a lot more depth to even a survey, like a typical survey. So that's been something that we've been, I don't want to say excited about, but that's something that's proving to be a benefit. So we're now training teams in every state that Seva works in to try and scale this up and ensure that data collection just happens more organically. The other thing we did realize, and this was a concern that we had, so we're trying to fix this. So we've been collecting data now within using these community data collectors since January because of the NRCCA protest and the Delhi riots, and now through the COVID lockdown. Phone surveys for us became a little bit complicated because essentially what was happening is that a woman's phone number was now just in a community, right? So if she would call and the number had changed of the respondent, or the number, or somebody else picked up, it is another woman in the informal economy and her numbers out there, and it is our responsibility to protect data collectors as well. So people were getting harassing calls and things, and you can't really switch your phone off. So we've been working on some other alternate means of trying to mitigate that harm. One of the things we're doing is getting local leaders in the community to cross-check the numbers, because anyway that work has to get done, and we only send in very verified numbers to our respondents. Additionally, we're working on just getting them alternate cell phones with or
time is So if just please complete this point.
But that's basically it. The ethics of trying to make sure data collectors are also protected in this world where they become participants, equal creators of the research. That was all.
Okay,
thank you, Priya.
Great. Thanks. I don't see too many questions from the audience in this round. So I would like to, I think a lot of really interesting questions have come up. I'm going to actually quickly use like maybe 2-3 minutes to summarize and then go back and do a rapid fire to all of you on this panel to see if you have any reflections from things that you heard in the other panel that you want to react to, or just any reflections broadly. I think what's really important and distinctive about the issues that came up in this panel that did not fully get surfaced in the previous panel is really the issue of privacy in a big way that Rashmi talked about. She did talk about representativeness, social desirability bias, and what was interesting is in the way she framed it is, are we somehow getting too easy to reach respondent and missing out the ones that are more difficult to reach, whose point of view and whose responses would be different and would give us a different picture altogether. So how do we really, she talked about it as representativeness, but it also is about exclusion. And are we really talking to people? Are we really getting the full representation of frontline workers and their responses, because the contexts are different, even for frontline workers in different states. And also the fact that if there is fear of backlash, are you really more likely to hear socially appropriate responses, and how do you design your surveys so that that doesn't happen? And talked also about the example of privacy and women having their 65% of the women having their speakerphones on, which was also really important as we think about privacy, because we think we have protected, but with that kind of statistic, I'm not too sure. I thought Pranita was really reminded us how our work has to be centered on the population whose needs we're really trying to surface through these studies. And the context is very important. Being solution oriented is very important, but involving local stakeholders to whom responsiveness is going to be evoked in the design of these studies is also important. And having a local partner. I think one of the issues is in all the work that we do with gender, we always need to lean on a strong local partner, maybe a women's rights organization, that for referrals and redressals and all the issues that we talked about in the first panel in any case. And she also talked about access to technology and that being limited, even the number of minutes a woman can hold a phone. To me, which was a very compelling statistic around access and how do you mitigate against this kind of bias or exclusion. By nature, designing your surveys on mobile is in a way excluding layers and layers of such vulnerability. I think what was really important was Priya reinforced the whole idea of being centered to the population and their needs. And to really, she talked about a dual process of seeking consent, not really, really trying to give protection against backlash to women, but how in this context, they've had to filter out voices because of how they have to take this data and aggregate it up for policy response. And I thought that was really compelling, that in a way, we are also excluding women's voices. And that is also an ethical dilemma, which I thought was very interesting. She also reminded us that gender, I mean, the whole intersectionality lens in doing work, because even though you're doing work on health systems, we are talking to women providers, and we're talking about to women providers that face power and asymmetry in their facilities, but also in their homes and communities to really have that gender frame. So all of these issues are kind of different than the first panel. And I just want to remind us that therefore, when we design and think about our ethics for specific populations, we do have a more acute and sensitive lens around that. So, and then of course, Paramita, you talked a lot about involvement of women and training women, both as an economic opportunity, but also to be more reflexive and introspective and perhaps getting better data quality. So with all of this, I mean, I think what I would like to say is you've heard your panelists, you have heard others. If I were to give you one minute to go around, and maybe we'll try it with the other panelists after this. If I was to say one thing that you feel is a key takeaway from listening to everybody, please don't reinforce the point you already made. We heard that. Any one thing that you feel you heard that you hadn't thought about, and one thing that you feel is a specific solution that you'd like to advocate for. So I'm going to start with Rashmi. We'll go in the same order. Rashmi.
Thank you, Priya, for that summary. I would say what struck to me, although underlyingly that was the thing that has been at the back of my mind, is the empathy at the center of research that Priya had mentioned. And I think that is the key to keep in mind when we are designing research. And just want to say just one last part. In the context of COVID, there is a sense of urgency and speed to learn fast and get things out really fast, which actually accentuates the usual tension that exists between getting things fast and getting things right. I think using the empathy lens that Priya has mentioned, we as a research community should invest time in thinking through the ethics while designing the study. Thanks.
Thanks. And for the rest of the panelists, do come on video for a second if you feel like, and make your 1-minute pitch. Pranita.
So I think one of the important point I have not been able to reconcile really on that part is about this whole issue around confidentiality and privacy. And I feel hearing that as a researcher, probably we can go, or we should go with a level that will get compromised given the situation and the context we are talking about, and then bring that whole aspect of what Priya said, and just that empathy in terms of that, if that is the situation and that's the reality, then what should we gather in terms of research, and then how best to use that research to address the concerns and issues. So that's what I want to say.
Thanks. Paramita?
Hi. Yeah, so one of the things that I think I really liked about how that we learned from this is figuring out how to do goal-oriented surveys, which goal-oriented surveys like having one clear thing instead of just using this as a process to collect data to clearly define a goal while we're going in. And the other thing I like from one of the things that we are taking away from all of this is also how to like set up an institutional rapid assessment of getting this research reviewed and processed. So from the earlier panel, we spoke a lot about fast-lining and streamlining IRB processes. So how do we make sure that we don't lose time through such a lockdown and make sure that the work is done quickly?
Thanks. Priya? Can't hear you. Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Priya, you
So
are
the
on
one
mute.
thing that, okay, so the one thing that I'm taking away from hearing the first lot and now this panel as well, that you will never have all the solutions to ethics and ethical dilemmas, especially when you are going to do research in these very, very extraordinary times, where research is really required, evidence is required to address the new situation that is evolving. But at the same time, you'll be constantly sort of going back and forth with what you can do and you cannot do. And from essentially working with a lot of women, I think the most important thing will be to allow the women to decide if they want. And I think that is the core ethical training around consent, privacy, confidentiality, to have that sensibility of when not to push.
Great. Excellent. Thanks a lot to this fabulous panel. We didn't have too many questions, or unfortunately, maybe they're going to come later. So we will surface them back to you. So we are now like 6 minutes to close. So, and we've actually had a 50% dropout. That is very sad. Okay, so there is one question to Priya Das. Rajiv has asked, Priya, how do you know that the partner organization that is enabling numbers for you is not building any kind of coercion at that stage? Very quick response, because then there are actually a couple of others which I missed. Sorry.
Okay. So quickly, Rajiv, so we are going to a local partner who actually works with these women, but not necessarily on the issues that we are looking at. And we have a double sort of process of consent. So actually, to say, even in our feasibility round, we had women who didn't give consent despite their numbers being shared, and we did not push that at all. So I can't say that there won't be any coercion, but this is the way we are trying to mitigate the process, if there is.
Okay, so that's great. I think most of the other questions were about the previous panel. So I'm going to turn it over to Babita, who's going to close this session. And before she comes on, I'd like to thank everybody who's remaining here and everybody who participated in this first dialogue. And Babita is going to talk about next steps and our next conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Priya. So just want to reiterate a big thank you to everyone, the speakers, all of you who've participated quite actively. These are some of the summaries of solutions that came up on the chat today, but we will share this in detail. The plan for the next steps. Tomorrow, we will share a quick summary of what we heard today, but without having had the time to synthesize it, but we will share the video recording and a quick summary of points that came up today. But we're hoping really with this to build a repository of resources to improve collective practice. As we've seen, there's already kind of collaborations and resources being shared, and that really was the intent, and we'd like to build on that and facilitate that. We'd also kind of try to want to kind of look at how we can synthesize our learnings from this session to share with the community. So we will be in touch and we will share furthermore on this front. Next slide, please, Rohan. Just wanted to announce the next upcoming event. The next dialogue that we have planned is building off this session, but we're probably expanding the geography a little more. We're looking at countries in South Asia, so there will be perspective from multiple geographies, and it's really building off this conversation. We will be in touch with you regarding this. This is scheduled to be in the last week of July, but we will be in touch with you on this further. So we have finished 3 minutes before time. Thanks once again for staying so late and participating so actively. We recognize it is intense and we've gone through a lot of stuff today, but this question has been coming up, and there have been and we have barely maybe touched some of them. So this is an ongoing conversation, and we hope to continue that with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you.